He told them about the subsurface interface radar, which would reveal any internal structure, but which was non-destructive. They assured him a permit as soon as he could arrange it. But there was a problem. The radar and its operator were very expensive. However, at this point it had to be the next step. Soon after arriving back in the States, Ron received another call, this time from the scientist at Los Alamos who had done the analysis on the specimen Colonel Irwin had sent there on Ron's behalf. John Baumgartner, a geophysicist, questioned Ron about the region from which the specimen came. Ron then asked him to come see for himself, an invitation which he accepted. Ron returned to Turkey for another meeting a month later in May, and then on June 2, 1985, John Baumgartner accompanied Ron and Dave Fassel to Turkey. Using all three types of metal detectors, they scanned the site, placing rocks and markers at every place they got a reading. They then connected these rocks with ribbons, revealing the pattern of a massive ship. Dave found a specimen which John examined and found to be consistent with hand-wrought iron.
My name is John Baumgartner from Los Alamos National Laboratory. I've had the privilege of being on this expedition with Ron Wyatt and David Fassel this last week to the site east of Dobizet in eastern Turkey, investigating the site of a large boat-shaped object.
Okay, would you show us briefly this specimen that Mr. Fassel owns and that we wish we owned?
Okay. It's striking in the fact of its angular character. Seem to have some preferred planes in the object on the outside as well as the inside. This inner portion appears to be a silica replacement of something. This would represent, if the interpretation is correct, a portion of an angle bracket, and we see a corner of it here. It's interesting that it apparently still displays the grain structure of the iron.
Now, does this seem to be cast iron or wrought iron?
I would say it's has the character of wrought iron, and it appears that this is almost pure iron oxide here, this outer portion.
All right, from your own use of metal detecting equipment out on the site, John, would you say that this is an isolated piece of iron?
No, we found just an incredible amount of iron in this formation. This is one of this was sampled from one of the many points along the stores. We were on the starboard side where we collected this sample. They appear to be regularly spaced along the boat.
But Ron knew the difficulty they would have in convincing anyone else that this object contained the fossilized remains of a massive ship. The general public simply didn't understand about petrification and frost wedging, which fractured petrified wood. Even more importantly, Ron was discovering that many trained geologists didn't recognize pre-flood petrified wood because it doesn't contain the growth rings of post-flood wood. None of the specimens he had taken from the site had growth rings, and because they were fractured from the weathering, they were only fragments of timbers, unrecognizable as wood to most people. There were no growth rings because the biblical account states that there was no rain prior to the flood, but that a mist watered the face of the earth. Growth rings result when the growth of the tree halts due to cessation of its water supply during the cooler season or during a drought. Scientists who reject the biblical account even agree that carboniferous plants contain no growth rings, but this would be a stumbling block to many. On the western side, the rib timbers had been exposed to weathering and had fragmented and were rapidly falling away, leaving only the empty spaces where they had once been. The only way to distinguish the rib timbers on the side that still retained portions of them was from the color difference in the fragmented ribs from the soil surrounding them. The exposed ribs were, for the most part, now reduced to very small fragments, but they still remained in place. By this time, Ron was convinced that this was indeed Noah's Ark, and this ship, as such, is the oldest man-made structure on earth, and it is in the exact condition that was to be expected, but it wasn't what the world wanted to see. They were looking for a barge-shaped ship, still intact or perhaps broken in half, but still wooden, not petrified. And they were looking for it on Mount Ararat, even though this volcano had experienced several eruptions, the most recent in the mid-1800s, which was very similar to the Mount St. Helens eruption, which blew out an entire portion of the mountain.
The upshoot of the interest of the group at Los Alamos is that Dr. Baumgartner made an appointment with myself and and David Fassold to meet some people out in Dallas that were considering funding part of the documentation on this formation. And David suggested that a subsurface interface radar scan of the site would be helpful and useful since we were denied permissions to excavate. And of course I was very happy with that prospect, and the results of our meeting in Dallas was that the project to do a radar scan of the site was funded.
Everyone's hopes were riding on the radar scans. Only the internal structure could have survived the weathering which was fragmenting everything on and near the surface. Dave also arranged for ABC's 2020 to cover the event. On August 1st, 1985, Ron arrived with the permit and was joined by John and his group, which included other scientists from Los Alamos. They went directly to the site and repeated the metal detector scans, again laying out the pattern of ribbons. The Los Alamos scientists also measured the site with sophisticated surveying methods and confirmed that it was 515 feet and 7 inches. Dave would arrive a little later with the radar and its operator, Tom Fenner of GSSI. 2020 was also on their way. But with all the attention the outsiders were receiving, the local guerrillas took this opportunity to make trouble. Commandos were assigned to protect the men at the site, and they positioned themselves in the crevices around the ship. But suddenly shots rang out, and the commandos quickly rose up and fired upon the terrorists, sending them fleeing, but not before killing several. Martial law was declared, and by the time Dave, the radar, and 2020 arrived, the site was off limits. It was a terrible disappointment, and everyone's frustration was intense. But the coverage by 2020 documented the metal detector scans and other evidences, making the public aware for the first time of what was happening on Doomsday Mountain.
Do you believe Noah's Ark actually existed? Could the legend that sounds like a fairy tale really become proven fact? Well, the search has been going on since biblical times, and in a moment you're going to meet some people who are positive they have found the Ark. Now, we know such claims have been made before, but a few months ago, these people came to 2020 with some new and intriguing scientific findings.
The boat-shaped site was first found and photographed by a Turkish army captain back in 1959. It was quickly explored and dismissed as a freak of nature. But Wyatt, an amateur archaeologist, rekindled interest in it a few years ago. He brought in Dave Fassold, a marine salvage expert, to assess it. Fassold felt he knew a shipwreck when he saw one. He became obsessed with it.
For over a year, I haven't dreamed about anything else, from the time I put my head on the pillow to the time I wake up. And that's all I think about all day long. And I'm sure that's all Ron thinks about.
The Doomsday Mountain team brought in some high technology to explore the oldest legend of man.
There's one.
They began scanning their site with a molecular frequency generator. It's a device used by surgeons to pinpoint cancer tumors, and it's been used by Fassel to locate underwater treasure. This time, the molecular frequency generator began to pick up a unique pattern of iron lines beneath the earth.
Okay, bring that one up.
They began placing ribbons along those lines. The finished shape, outlined by the ribbons, was that of a huge ship, the approximate length and width of Noah's Ark, as described in the Bible. The fascinating field of ribbons soon attracted higher academic interest.
That looks like iron. Okay.
Dr. John Baumgartner, a physicist with Los Alamos Laboratories, sent samples back to the lab for analysis and confirmed that the metal they were tracing with the ribbons was indeed iron. With the width and the length known, the only remaining question was depth. By locating the depth of the hull, they could determine if the boat-shaped object had the cargo capacity described in the biblical ark. To resolve this final issue, Wyatt and Fassel brought geologist Tom Finner to Turkey with his company's heavy-duty subsurface radar equipment. Gear like this located the black box cockpit recorder on the floor of the frozen Potomac River after the Air Florida crash.
Suppose this rock were a foot or 2 feet underground. Would it give you a reading as to where that was? Could you locate it?
Yes, we could.
Is it possible that there will be a moment at which you'll say, this is a man-made object?
The symmetry of the feature suggests it's a boat. I hope to prove that the underground structure is in fact that of a boat.
Just before we arrived to do this story, several groups of climbers, including ark hunters from the Probe Ministries of Texas, were attacked high on Mount Ararat by a band of Kurdish separatists. They sent in several battalions of elite commandos who swept up Mount Ararat, chasing the rebellious Kurds, with predictable results. Some were killed, some arrested, but others escaped southward toward, you guessed it, the boat-shaped site on Doomsday Mountain. It became a hornet's nest of anti-guerrilla activity. The restrictions of martial law left the American explorers isolated from the outside world. Not even a telephone.
Well, I'll be back next year, for sure.
Yeah. Anyway, we're going to hang in like smell on a skunk till there's nothing left to get this done.
Hang in like the smell of a skunk. The Turkish government stopped the exploration. What now?
Since we were there, Barbara, things have cooled down, and they've sent their own team of scientists in to take a look at this site. It's a very fascinating location.
John Baumgartner did a live interview with CBN during the event, and this too brought the site to public notice. John explained that the site was completely unique. Not only had they performed metal detector scans on the site, but they had also examined other sites which, at first glance, appeared similar, but which showed absolutely no metal readings.
You suspect that the formation itself could be different than any other formation on the mountain?
We feel the formation is quite unique. There are several formations that have a superficially similar shape, but and we've investigated several of them, and as we investigate them, we find they are do not have the special characteristics we find in the site we've been focusing on.
But still, the radar had not taken place. Back at home, Ron approached a Tennessee businessman he had worked for many years earlier, whom he knew had funded worthy projects in the past, with the request that he assist with the radar equipment. This gentleman, who asked to remain anonymous, told Ron he would purchase a radar system. His business would retain ownership, but he told Ron he could use it any time he wished. He purchased the SIR-3, a system similar to the SIR-8 that had been brought to Turkey in August. It was shipped directly to Ron's home in Madison, Tennessee, and upon its arrival he immediately took it to the customs office and registered it, placing the customs declarations in both the radar case and the bag which contained the cables and small antenna.